Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Catalyze Your Self. I am Gayatri, and today we are stepping into a conversation that is both familiar and new. The conversation about legacy. Legacy is not a new theme in this podcast. In fact, it is one we've been building towards across seasons. If you go back to season 1, episode 32, Cultivate Your Legacy's Lasting Impact, you'll remember we explored legacy in its broadest sense. We talked about different kinds of legacy: accidental, inherited, and intentional, and how mindful living shapes what we leave behind. Then in season 2, episode 19, You and the Bigger Picture, we shifted the lens to presence and the impact in real time. We explored how our choices, even in the very smallest of moments, can ripple outward and begin shaping the cultures and the systems we are part of. And right after that, in season 2, we touched in episode 20, Everyday Conscious Leading. We brought it closer to home. We reflected on how the micro moments of leadership, of listening, of pausing before reacting, of checking in with ourselves before checking out, become patterns that build trust and safety and culture over time. And if any of you have not yet listened to those yet, or if you would like to refresh your memory on those ideas and concepts, I invite you to revisit those episodes. Because today, in episode 27 of our second season, we are taking the next step. We are focusing on how our intentions design our legacy. We defined what legacy is. We recognize the ripples of our presence. We have seen how everyday leadership already shapes culture. And now we're moving from recognition to design. Today's conversation is about how we intentionally design our legacy, not just what people will remember about us, but what patterns and values and practices will continue on because of us. Not just reputation or memory, rather repeatability and the lasting sustainability of it. And this is where our self-leadership becomes so essential, because legacy is not something that happens later. It is what we are designing now through the choices that we make and the integration with which we live. Up until now, we have established something important. Every one of us leaves an impact. Whether it is the culture we create in our homes, the tone we set in our teams, or the presence we bring into a room, our choices ripple outward. That is not the question anymore. But here's where the conversation often stops. We recognize we leave an impact, but we don't always pause to ask, what kind of impact is it? And is it the one we want to see carried forward? That's the shift into design, because impact by itself can be accidental. It can be unconscious. It can even be contradictory, where one part of our presence inspires while another part quietly destroys trust. We've all seen that in leaders, in family systems, even in ourselves at times. Legacy design asks something deeper. What do I want to be repeated when I'm no longer in the room? Not just remembered, repeated. Not just admired, but embodied. Not just spoken about, but lived by others. And this is where intention enters the picture. When we are intentional, we don't just leave a trail of moments behind us. We begin to embed patterns others can practice without us. And that is the difference between impact that fades and legacy that endures. So the invitation here is simple but profound. Am I leaving my legacy to chance, or am I designing it with intention? And if intention is the blueprint of our legacy, integration is what makes that blueprint durable. Without integration, legacy fragments. It becomes a reputation in one place, a memory in another, a handful of impressions that may or may not reflect who you really were in a completely different scenario. With integration, legacy becomes consistent, transferable, and steady. It becomes something others can practice, not just admire. And this is where the SIRE model is not just a personal framework, it becomes the architecture of legacy. Through self-awareness, we recognize the values and principles that matter enough to carry forward. Awareness gives that language to the why, so it doesn't remain unspoken. Through self-inspiration, we keep those values alive with energy and meaning. Inspiration ensures our legacy is not just rules to follow, but a vision that people want to embody. Through self-regulation, we show what steadiness looks like under pressure. Regulation is often what makes a legacy trustworthy, because people remember not only what we said, they remember how we held ourselves when things got hard. Through self-expression, we make that intangible visible. Legacy cannot be transferred if it is not expressed. Expression turns inner clarity into practices others can repeat. And through self-reflection, that ecosystem that holds it all together, that holds SIRE together, we keep refining. Reflection ensures our legacy isn't stuck in one moment of time, but it keeps evolving with integrity. With these elements within us, and when they are integrated, our legacy stops being dependent on a memory or a personality. It becomes a rhythm others can now step into. And that's the deeper invitation here, because legacy does not have to mean a grand achievement or a name etched in history. Legacy can be as simple as the consistent pattern of presence others feel safe enough to repeat in their own lives. The pause before a grounded, intentional response, the courage to speak with clarity, the ability to hold boundaries with steadiness, the reflection that keeps our inner selves aligned. Integration ensures that when we step away for a day, for a season, or even a lifetime, the practices don't disappear with us. They continue because they were never, ever about just us. They were designed into the culture through consistency of our integrated mind. When we talk about intentionality in designing our legacy, it helps to have the lenses that makes the invisible visible. Two of the ones I return to often are what I call the fade test and the fork test. The fade test asks, if I were to step away for 6 months, a year, or even permanently, what would continue unchanged because of how I have led? And what would quietly fade the moment I'm gone? It is not an easy question to sit with, because the fade test reveals something most of us find hard to see. that some of what we thought we were building isn't embedded. It is dependent. It is dependent on us, on our personality, on our energy, on our constant presence. I have seen this in organizations where a leader leaves and suddenly practices of care, clarity, or accountability just dissolve within weeks. Not because those things never mattered, but because they were never fully designed into the culture. They were carried by one person's effort, not embedded as a shared rhythm. And I've seen the opposite too, where someone's presence created such a steady practice that even after they've moved on, the habits, patterns remain. Teams still pause before decisions, still hold the space for honesty, still prioritize reflection, not because the person is there reminding them, but because the rhythm was designed into the way the culture breathes. The same is true in our personal life. Think about our family traditions and rituals. If a tradition only survives because one person insists on it, it often fades because when they're no longer holding it up, the value of it disappears with them. But when the meaning is seen, understood, loved, and shared, when everyone understands the why and not just the what, that tradition carries forward. Maybe it's the way a family starts meals with gratitude. Maybe it's the way a friend group checks in honestly when someone seems quiet. If those practices keeps happening, even when the original voice is absent, that's legacy by design. And that's what the fade test reveals. It simply shows us that when we have built dependency instead of design, and that awareness is where intentional legacy begins. And then there's the fork test. The fork test happens at crossroads of our lives, the moments when values collide. Speed versus quality, harmony versus candor, control versus trust. These are the places where legacy can really be defined, because what people carry forward is not the moments when things were easy. It's the moments when the choices were hard. They remember what we did when the pressure was high, and they repeat the decisions we made when no option was perfect. If I consistently choose speed over quality, even if I talk about excellence, my legacy will be urgency. If I consistently choose harmony over candor, even if I preach about truth, my legacy will be silence. The fork test shows us that legacy is not what we aspire to in theory. It's what we choose to practice when the choice in front of us is not the one of comfort. And it's not only in leadership, in families. Children notice when values are chosen at a fork. Do we choose presence with them or productivity? Do we choose honesty in a hard conversation, or do we smooth it over for peace? Those repeated choice becomes the inheritance of our legacy, whether we intended it or not. And here's another deeper point. Most of us don't announce our legacy, we live it. And others interpret it through what they see us repeat. The fade test and the fork test help us reflect and ask, what will endure without me? What will be remembered because of the choices I made under pressure? They are absolutely not about perfection. They're absolutely not about judgment. They are about clarity. Because when we see what fades and what forks, we see exactly where our intention is still needed. And that clarity gives us the chance to design our legacy instead of leaving it to some accident. The fade test and the fork test gives us clarity about what continues on without us and what values we choose when it really counts. But there's another layer here, because not every choice we make at the fork will be the one we will be proud of. And that's where ownership matters. Legacy is not built on perfection, it's built on patterns. And some of the patterns people remember most clearly are the ones that came after we stumbled, when we missed the mark, when urgency overrides quality, when silence replaces speaking up clearly, when performance sneaks back in. The way we respond in that moment becomes part of our legacy. Do we hide behind the choice? Do we defend it? Do we just stick on it because of how our pride is feeling? Do we move on and hope no one noticed? Or do we hold it with enough steadiness to say, this was my choice, this was my impact, and this is how I will return to alignment? The act of ownership is more memorable than the original mistake because it signals something deeper than being right. It signals being real. It tells the people around us there's a culture where accountability is safe, where responsibility is possible, and where integrity matters more than image, pride, ego. And here's the beauty of it all. Ownership is repeatable. When others see us take responsibility without collapse, without excuses, without self-erasure, they learn it's possible to do the same. They see that accountability does not have to mean punishment. It can mean clarity. It can mean alignment. It can mean integration. And that too becomes part of the legacy we leave behind. So if the fade test asks what continues without us, and the fork test asks what we choose when values collide, then ownership asks, what will people remember about how we handled ourselves when we got it wrong? That's as much part of our legacy design as any success. And if we've been asking what continues without us, what choices define us at the fork, and how we hold ourselves in ownership, the next step is design. Legacy isn't only reflection, it is practice. One way to make this real is by creating what I call a living legacy portfolio. This is not a list of achievements or a list of values we hope people remember us by. It is a small set of intentional patterns we live because we want them to be repeatable. They're behaviors that invite others to think, to question, to trust, and to grow. Maybe one of those patterns is pausing before reacting. That moment of presence not only keeps us aligned, it also teaches others that clarity matters. It creates space for critical thinking instead of fueling defensiveness. Maybe another pattern is welcoming difference without fear. That does not mean we agree with every voice or idea. It means we model curiosity before judgment, and we practice listening without shrinking back or attacking. When and what we choose consistently will help us disrupt that old narrative that difference equals threat. We show that difference can be a source of depth, not division. Another pattern might be interrupting bias with steadiness. This can be as simple as asking, what else could be true here? When a quick judgment rises, or creating a moment of curiosity when a stereotype sneaks into a decision. This practice is not about shaming. It is about redirecting. It signals to others that bias is not invincible, it is not invisible, and it can be interrupted with presence. These kinds of patterns, critical thinking instead of reflex, curiosity instead of fear, discernment instead of bias, they all elevate our legacy beyond personal integrity. They begin to shift a culture, and they give permission for others to think more deeply, connect more openly, and treat each other more humanely. And the portfolio does not need to be long. 3 or 5 of these lived, repeatable patterns and practices are enough. And it's up to you if you want to have more or less. Because when they're consistent, all it needs to be is consistent. They embed, they outlast us. They become rhythms others step into until they no longer feel like ours. They feel like part of the fabric of the space we've left behind. And that's when legacy stops being a memory of who we were and becomes a design for who we help others become. In our last episode, episode 26, Breakthrough Our Barriers, we looked very closely at the patterns our nervous system created to protect us, patterns that over time began to hold us back. We explored how breakthrough was not smashing through those walls, but recognizing the difference between true danger and remembered discomfort and choosing presence over protection. And that work matters here also, because when barriers begin to dissolve, what we have left is freedom. Freedom from over-preparation, freedom from constant apology, freedom from over-functioning or shrinking back. And the question that follows, freedom, is, now what? Now what do we want to build with the space those barriers once occupied? What do we want others to inherit, not as weight, but as wisdom? And this is where intentional legacy lives. Barriers kept us repeating protection. Breakthrough opened us to design. And with that design, we have a tremendous opportunity, because every freedom we claim becomes that opportunity to embed a different pattern for us and the people around us. When we stop over-functioning, we teach others that worth is not tied to exhaustion. When we stop apologizing unnecessarily, we signal that belonging does not require shrinking. When we pause instead of reacting, we show that presence can be stronger than urgency. The work of moving through barriers and the work of designing legacy are not separate. They're stages of the same path. One clears the space and the other chooses what to fill it with. And if we choose with intention, what fills that space becomes not just our own growth, but a design others can carry forward long after we are gone. And now, as we close today's episode, I would invite all of us to spend some time reflecting. Let's ask ourselves, what parts of my impact are strong enough to continue without me? And what would fade the moment I step away? At the forks in the road, what values collide? Which choices do I consistently make? And what do these choices reveal about the legacy I'm truly leaving? And when my choices don't align with my intention, how steady am I in owning them without excuses, without collapse, so that the responsibility itself becomes part of what others carry forward? Legacy is not a speech we give at the end of our life, or it's a speech given regarding us at the end of our lives. It is the lived portfolio of patterns we practice now, the intentional rhythms of awareness, inspiration, regulation, expression, and reflection that others can step into, not because we insisted on it, not because we controlled it, but because we modeled what it looks like and made it an invitation for them to consider it. That is the difference between a legacy that's accidental and a legacy that is designed. One fades as a memory, the other endures as practice. And this is the elevation of our work. We move from breaking through our barriers into designing what fills the freedom that follows. From protection to intention, from memory to blueprint. And next week, in episode 28, we move into how we go about leading beyond the self. This is where we'll step into the next layer, how legacy moves from being held by an individual to being embedded in the systems we are part of. We will talk about how cultures and structures and rhythms we design can carry forward integration and conscious leadership long after we've left the room. Thank you so much for joining me today. I am Gayatri, and I'm grateful for this time that we shared together. Until next time, keep noticing what continues. Keep choosing at the forks with intention, and keep designing the legacy that outlives you, not as a memory, but as patterns that endures without you.